name is Wesley Cable, and I want to welcome you to episode number 4 of Obsessed with Wine podcast. In this podcast, we explore fine wines from all over the world through conversations with those who share my love of wine and winemaking. Tonight, I've opened a beautiful bottle of Petite Sirah from MCV Wines in Paso Robles, California. Paso Robles is located in San Luis Obispo County, California, where there are 4 distinct AVAs, including Grand Valley, York Mountain, Edna Valley, and of course, the Paso Robles AVA. The Paso Robles AVA covers 26,000 acres of vineyards, nearly 200 wineries, and more than 100 tasting rooms. Tonight's guest is Matt Villard, the owner and winemaker for MCV Wines in Paso Robles. Matt comes from a wine collecting family and got to experience good wines at a young age. MCV Wines specializes in Petite Sirah, which Matt has been making since his first vintage in 2011. MCV Wines also makes a wine they refer to as Black, which is a blend of 3 black grapes, including Petite Sirah, Tannat, and Petit Verdot. In this interview, I sit down with Matt and we discuss his inspirational wine journey, the one bottle of wine that made him fall in love with Petite Sirah, and a fabulous winemaker tasting experience they offer that could have you tasting some of his initial 2011 Petite Sirah and some of his other wines from the barrel. Well, Matt, I say this all the time, but one of the reasons I'm so passionate about wine and doing this podcast is because of stories like yours. Not only are your wines awesome, but you have such an inspiring story, and I can't wait to share that with the audience. So welcome to Obsessed with Wine.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So I want to jump right into how you got started in wine. I've heard you talk in the past about your parents were collectors of wine and wine was available for you at the dinner table to try. So would you say that's kind of where you developed your love for wine?
You did do your research. Yes. I mean, that's pretty much where it was. It never occurred to me that you could make wine. Obviously somebody made wine, but it never occurred to me you could do it. I mean, I grew up going to vineyards and wineries and stuff like that because my parents were collectors. I mean, there was a place in Santa Cruz Mountain Vineyards that my parents were friends with the original owner. They would go out on like a sailboat and all that stuff. Dude made an absolute fortune in real estate in Southern California in the 80s. And so it was like, a gentleman retirement kind of a thing. And it was an absolutely fabulous vineyard. You make the most wonderful wine. So his name was Ken. But my parents would go tasting in this basically converted barn, and we'd stay at our friends had a house there in Santa Cruz in the Seabright area. But we'd go up, and their son Brandon was about the same age as me, but we'd go tearing through the vineyard, finding, snakes and lizards and running around, and my parents would be tasting. And, by the time I was 12 or 13, they let me taste as well when we came back.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, so I grew up going to vineyards and wineries and all that stuff and grew up drinking wine, definitely a little bit more old fashioned. So, I remember taking sips of wine and stuff like that since I was probably 12 or 13. By the time I was 15 or 16, half a glass of wine with dinner, nothing crazy. I wasn't getting drunk at home or anything, but then I went to UC Davis as pre-med, and my dad's a doctor. And actually my family's, a lot of them are in medicine. My dad's a doctor. My mom runs his office. My sister's in hospital administration. We have a couple of pharmacists, a bunch of nurses, all kinds of stuff in the family, cousins and aunts and uncles and everything else. And so I was supposed to be pre-med. And so I went to UC Davis and was doing that. And then my spring quarter of my freshman year, I took intro to winemaking. And it was basically just this light bulb went off like, wait, so somebody actually has to make the wine and there's a whole process for it. And it was just kind of this downhill spiral from there, apparently, because pre-med went out the window and that was all I wanted to do. And so there you have it.
So before that happened, you had this kind of epiphany or whatever you want to call it there. You never considered a career in wine. That was never something that was on the radar or anything for you at all?
Nope. Not until I took intro to winemaking.
I don't know what it is about that class, Intro to Winemaking, because lots of people I talk to who've taken some classes at UC Davis, they say that, gosh, it was that Intro to Winemaking class that really kind of turned the light on for me. So I'm wondering what it is about that particular class. But
it's a fascinating class. I have no idea, but it shines that, because there's this weird disconnect between making wine, making beer, making food, like chefing, like being a chef. There's this weird disconnect. Americans aren't always the best at appreciating where things come from. And I saw this a lot. My wife's from Pasadena, Altadena, and she ended up doing fruit science before they had a viticulture program at Cal Poly. And so she was guilty of this till she came up and started doing fruit science and stuff like that. But I would see it. You just go to the grocery store and it's there. There's no connection between how it's made. And so you take this class and all of a sudden it breaks that bridge of this is where it comes from. My family is farmers. My family came from France. Villard is a common Southern French name. There's actually a very famous French winemaker named Francois Villard, who actually, when you see pictures, he could be my brother. Like, the first time I showed a picture of him in the Wine Spectator, Wine Enthusiast, or whatever, to my wife, Teresa, she's like, holy, that's your brother. And I'm like,
yeah,
we're a cousin or something. I'm like, probably. And actually, I was reading more about him in an article one time, and I realized that our families are potentially from the actual same village. So we could actually be related. My uncle went to France to our original home village. It's like Provence Saint-Marie or something like that, Rose Saint-Marie Provence or something along those lines, which became known because they put in a ski lift. It's something they're known for. But apparently the town hall had burned down in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and so all of the records were gone. And so we're not entirely sure exactly who we're related to, but he comes from a similar area, so he could be a cousin of mine. We have a familial resemblance.
Interesting. So you're in college and you get this epiphany that this sounds like fun. I want to do this. Medicine's out of the way. Now I'm going to pursue a career in wine. Is that kind of how it was? And then where did you go from there?
I took a couple of years off of school, actually, and I was selling vineyard sprayers in Napa and Sonoma, meeting people. And that's how I met my very first boss in the industry, other than at Davis, where I worked for professors and stuff in the program. But I met Aaron Pott. When I was selling sprayers, I would swing by St. Super every once in a while and we'd hang out for a few. He was super nice. Aaron's a good dude. And so he promised me he would hire me. And this was like, it took me a very long time to graduate because I took a couple years off, but it was like 2003 or something. And he promised me I could have an internship with him when I graduated. And so 4 years later, 2007, I emailed him, and he was now no longer at St. Super. He was at Quintessa because he had turned St. Super around, and the Huneases had poached him to come to Quintessa. And so he hired me. Immediately when I sent him the email, I was like, yep, you're hired. It's fine. Awesome. And so, and it was pretty early in the season. I got kind of lucky because I didn't really research how internships worked, but it was like, January, February or something, because I realized I was graduating, needed to get wine. I'm like, oh, let's email Aaron. And so it was early enough where he still had everything open. I don't think they'd advertised for internships at that point yet. And he hired me. And then over the course of the summer, he had become the consultant and Charles Thomas became the winemaker, but they still held my position for me and everything. And so it worked out well. So Charles Thomas was my first boss. I still remember one of the best experiences it's like a standout memory as an intern, as a winemaker, was we were raised up on this forklift, which is not OSHA approved. Charles and I were around these like 7 barrels or something, and they gravity feed everything from processing through the ceiling at Quintessa. And so he and I were just standing there filling these barrels that the heads had been popped off, chatting for like 45 minutes. And it was awesome because I just got to sit there and just chat with Charles Thomas for like 45 minutes about whatever I wanted. And it's really special. I have another story about that. Like with my second internship was at Justin, and Fred and I spent 2 hours working on this. And they have a wine called Savant. And so before Savant is what it currently is, they started as an Amarone style Syrah. And so I remember getting this Syrah and that we sorted through the whole clusters, and then we laid it all out on picking bins, and we put it in the warm room with fans, and we dried it out, like, 2 tons or whatever it was, dried out 30% to make an Amarone style Syrah. And we threw it in these barrels with the heads off, and we were fermenting it, but it didn't have enough juice to skin ratio, and so the berries weren't popping. So Fred and I were literally in there shirtless, sticking our arms all the way to the bottom of the barrels and pulling these Syrah berries off the clusters like this. And he and I were just stained up our arms purple. And same thing. I just got to stand there for 2 hours just talking to Fred Holloway, somebody that's been in the wine industry for 25 years at that point. And that was 15, 20 years ago. Little moments like that stand out.
Yeah. So when you first got into the wineries and getting your hands dirty, did you know what you were getting into, or was there a learning curve there as far as
I had no idea what I was getting into. No idea. The actual work, and I saw this too coming up in the wine industry. There's a disconnect again, from drinking wine to making wine, where people think you're just standing around stomping on grapes and they magically turn into wine and then you're drinking wine. And it's just not the way it is. Making wine is suffering. You're cold, you're hot, you're wet, you're sticky, you're dirty, you're in pain. I worked my very first internship at Quintessa with a sciatic. I remember I was picking Brontes in the library block, UC Davis, for Andy Walker. I was working for Andy Walker's lab at the time, and we were picking white grapes at Toronto's, and I went to pick it up, and I just felt everything pinch. And so I worked my first 5 or 6 weeks at Quintessa with a Sidekick. I was running up and down stairs. I was hot. I was cold. I was working 60 hours a week, doing manual labor, carrying things, pushing things, whatever the case may be. My favorite example of this actually was at Justin. They're right off that boron mine, and their water filter broke. And so the first 2 weeks I was there, we were having to filter all water used, and wineries use quite a bit of water, through a plate and frame filter. And their production facilities on a hill like this. And so we were taking 100-gallon sumps of water up and down this hill. 110 gallons is what they are. So you'd fill them to 100 gallons of water. Water weighs 8 pounds a gallon. So we were pushing and pulling and 800 pounds up and down this hill all day, every day. And that's essentially, and this was August, so it was still 100 degrees in Paso out in the sun. And so that's kind of the epitome of winemaking. If you're not willing to push 800 pounds of water up a hill in 100 degrees, winemaking might not be for you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's really eye-opening, the physical labor and how tired you get doing the work. And I talk to a lot of people and I say, oh, yeah, I've done a couple of harvests. And they say, oh, I'd love to do that. It sounds like it's so fun. For a lot of people, it's eye-opening, like you were just talking about. Like, I really don't like to do this. I'm done. I don't.
Well, my dad grew up on a farm, so I mean, my work ethic wasn't terrible, but at the same time, it was completely eye-opening, unexpected, because he became a doctor, and I grew up, middle class in the Central Valley of California, and so I didn't have any really thing to equate it to, and so it was very eye-opening.
So was there ever a point where you're thinking, man, do I really want to do this, or was it, wow, no. this is what I want to do?
As soon as I did it for the very first time, exactly what I wanted to do every time. I think maybe it's genetic or something. Yeah. We're definitely good Southern French peasants, because hard work's never really bothered me that much. I don't mind the sweat and the blood and everything else. I actually fell off a ladder directly above me. We're in my lab right now. And I fell off a ladder, 10, 12 feet up. And
wow.
Not the first time it's happened. So it's dangerous. It's difficult, but there's nothing else I'd rather do. It's just, at the end of the day, you bring in these grapes and you make this thing that's just beautiful and expressive and wonderful and sometimes life-changing. I've had certain wines in my life that just kind of changed my life. And, your goal is to be able to do that. And it doesn't happen very often, but every once in a while you make something and you're just like, wow, that's incredible. And so, nothing else I'd rather do.
So after the adventures with Quintessa and Justin, so then what happened? Like, where did you go from?
After Justin was Gainey. Gainey was after Justin. It was a great internship. I loved my coworkers. I learned, it was what I would call a rough, difficult internship. I learned a lot of what not to do and the problems that can come with winemaking. But I learned some positives too. And then after that, I was at Chalone and then BV.
So at any of these times, are you thinking to yourself, I'm going to have my own label, I'm going to have my own wine someday? Was that something that was even on your mind at that time?
Yeah, I've always wanted to make my own wine. Well, then it's yours. I mean, there's nothing anybody can say about it. It's yours.
Yeah.
And there's goods and bads with that. I mean, at the end of the day, it's still yours, whether it's good or bad or there's problems. Even if you are the winemaker for a hands-off owner that just lives somewhere else that just pays you to make it, it's still theirs. At the end, when it's done and bottled, it's their property. So. Yeah.
So at BV, though, that's when you got injured or something and weren't able to finish out that harvest. Is that right? What happened there?
It's ambiguous. I was cleaning underneath a bunch of tanks, pressure washing, and I woke up with my knee not working. And it's ambiguous whether I hurt myself there or somewhere else or at home or whatever the case may be. So I was out for a while and they replaced me. And so,
So you ended up back in Paso Robles, right?
I did. I quit and went back to Paso.
And that's when you decided, I want to buy some grapes and try to make my own wine. You felt like at that time you were ready for that.
Yeah. Well, when you're young, when you're young, there's a lot of hard lessons to be learned. But yes, I did. And I've been very lucky, I think. So I didn't have any money into my name and I bought some grapes and I've managed to make this work with, loans and luck.
That's
to be honest, I shouldn't be so. The wines are really quite good. So it helps a lot when you make good wine.
Oh, absolutely. So that's one of the more inspiring things about your whole story is that you go through these internships and for whatever reason you end up with this injury and then you leave the harvest and you just decide, all right, now is the time. I'm going to buy these grapes and make my own wine. And so you decided to buy some Petite Sirah. So my question to you was, why Petite Sirah? And what drew you to those grapes?
I was in love with Pinot forever. Pinot is pretty finicky. Although I wouldn't mind working with some cold weather Pinot as opposed to warm weather Pinot. But I still remember the bottle that really put me on to Petite Sirah. When you're in college and you don't have a lot of money and you want to buy some wine, you're drinking Bogo and whatever else, like Petite Sirah. I was like, oh, I like Petite Sirah. But I still remember the bottle that made me think the Petite Sirah is special, something we worked with. I was tasting wine with my dad in Paso. We were probably staying with my grandparents in Cayucas. That's where I was living. When I was working for Justin, I lived there, but we would go over and we'd taste in Paso a lot. And I'm not even sure I was 21 at the time, but we were tasting at EOS. And so they used to have something called the Coupe Grande. And so they had Chardonnay and Petite Sirah. And this is back in like 2002, 2003. They had a $60 Petite Sirah. In 2003. I think it was worth every penny, but it really opened my eyes to what Petite Sirah could be. It was elegant, it was beautiful, it was ageable, just amazing. And so that is the bottle that really kind of turned me on to Petite Sirah. And from there on, I went back and I was working for Andy Walker at Davis, he's a very famous grape breeder. And so my goal was to move to Oregon and crossbreed Pinot and Petite Sirah until I came out with a colder weather ripening grape that would have more body and tannin than Pinot Noir, and maybe more like basically Petite Sirah, but cold weather. And so it didn't happen, obviously. I'm in Paso Robles. We don't have to worry about heat here, but that was kind of my goal. And So
as far as the grape itself, Petite Sirah, like what is that like to working with that grape?
Petite Sirah is easy. In some ways, anybody can make a decent Petite Sirah. It's going to be one-dimensional and blunt. But if you really want Petite Sirah to express itself, you need to be willing to work with it, to really work with the vineyard, work with the grape, and really finesse it along. Because it is a very tannic black grape, and so if you're not careful, it can get away from you, and you end up with essentially dark fruit and a whole ton of tannin. And it just kind of overpowers you. But if you're willing to really spend the time and the energy, you can really bring out something special and unique with Petite Sirah, something elegant. I think Robert Parker said maybe 15 or 20 years ago that Petite Sirah is the most underrated red grape. If you could get some winemakers out there that are willing to work with it, it could really become something special.
So what was the first vintage? What year was that? Was it 2011?
2011.
Okay. What did you make? Just one wine, just the Petite Sirah, or did you do anything else?
I had 3 wines. So I had a couple of different lots of Petite Sirah and a small amount of Syrah and Grenache. And so I made my flagship. I specialize in Petite Sirah, but I also specialize in Petite Sirah-based blends, unique blends. And so I am a very consummate blender. I love blending. Even within the program, I'm blending barrels and coopers and yeast strains and everything else. Like nothing is ever usually exactly the same because I want to have as many different aspects to each wine as I can possibly get, because the more you have, the more interesting the wine gets. I think I sent you a Rosewent and a Gemini, and so within there,
you did, yeah.
We get multiple ferments across the board, and so Rosewent we usually get 2 fermentation lots of that, 2 double macro bins, and so I'll use 2 different yeast strains. And then Gemini, same, we'll get 3-4 different fermentation lots, and I'll use 3 or 4 different yeasts, and then we go into 3 or 4 different coopers and different sizes and things like that to really kind of enhance the different aspects of what you can get. So I'm much more of a blender than a single, straight shooter. I like to have a lot of different stuff going on. I think it brings out the complexity. And so when people are worried about blends not being special, or they're like, oh, it's a way to hide flaws, it's not true. I mean, you can hide flaws with blends, but every component of a blend should bring out something more special and more unique about the wine. And so I like to blend.
So back in 2011, if we're going back, do you have any of that old 2011 still around?
I do.
Okay.
We're still
you
selling
ever break
it.
that open? Oh, you sell it. Okay.
We have maybe 30 cases left or something.
Uh-huh. So how is the wine, though? When you go back now and you drink it and you think,
It's beautiful. It's got at least another 5 years in it. It's a great seller. I made a whole bunch of it my first year. And so we're still slowly moving through it, but we use it fairly often in winemaker dinners because it's still showing so beautifully. And it can pair with a lot of different stuff. So we've used it from dessert course through main course through starter course. And so it's very, very broad. It's just a really solid wine. And like I said, it's got at least another 5 years, maybe 10 years in it. It's aging really beautifully. 11 was a very cold year for Paso. So tons of acid. And so I was blessed because I just come down from Napa. So I was used to acidic wine. Or cold weather. People in Paso were freaking out about how cold it was. And I'm like, what are you guys talking about? And for me, it was fine. Like I ended up with a great wine. I was tasting with my scorer and editor for the Wine Enthusiast a couple weeks ago. He came by. He was hanging out in Paso, and I was like, "Oh, come by for an hour and we'll drink and taste or whatever." And I was just about to have a bottling, so it was an off day. So instead of giving like the whole grand tour and barrel tasting, I was like, let's just hang out. And so one of my buddies actually came by and he brought a couple of his 11s. And so I opened my 11s. Wow. And so we were tasting through, and like the guys were like, "Wow, your 11's really still lively." And I'm like, "I think so." And so that was very nice to hear him say that. He's a really nice guy. I actually really like him. But, with professional scorers, you're kind of like never sure, what to do. So well, you want to try and impress him. And I was just so exhausted getting ready for this bottling that I was like, man, let's just hang out and it'll be fine. So.
Well, I was going to ask you about this a little bit later, but I'm going to bring it up now since you brought it up. So what is your opinion on the wine ratings? And, as a winemaker, are they important to you or are they not important to you? Where do you come out on the ratings and all that stuff? And I've seen some of your ratings and obviously you do very well. So what is your opinion on the ratings?
They are important, but I don't think they're the end all. And it's important to remember too that there's different scores that give different ratings. I mean, you have to remember too that it's what you like, not necessarily what the score is like. And so you can find scorers whose opinions you agree with and they're a good baseline, but don't limit yourself to just what one person likes. Go out and figure out what you like, but they're a good baseline. They give you kind of an idea of what's going on. So it's a very political question actually. So it's hard to answer too much about that. Because,
okay. That makes sense.
You don't want to offend anybody basically.
Sure.
Whether it's scorers or not scorers or whatever the case may be. I submit my wines to 5 or 6 different professional scorers that I think are legitimate good scores because, it's important. It's important to get a good baseline for your wines.
So I want to talk about the current wines that you make. So where are you making the wines? Do you make them at your facility there or do you use a custom crush facility? Where do you make wines now?
All at my facility. So I was at an AP facility, custom crush facility before. And then in 2020, we moved into our facility. And so everything is made here now.
If you had to describe your winemaking style, what's your style?
Old fashioned.
Okay.
I'll say that. Unabashedly old fashioned.
Okay,
so
and what does that mean?
Is probably like you would think of as Napa in the 90s and the early 2000s. So we always avoided fruit forward, but before this super hot ferment, high extraction wines really took off. And so that's really my style, more balanced, more, I guess some people call it old world style, I guess, but that just tells you how far off the extracted style people have gone in Paso and everywhere else, even in Napa. And it's kind of sad. I've tasted wines coming out of Napa and it tastes like it's tannin and no flavor. And so it's not my style. My style is much more balanced. I want to be able to have food with my wine. I want to be able to have my wine without food. I want it to age. I want it to be interesting. The problem with some of these hot ferments and over extracted style is they just don't age or they're overpowering. And it's just not what I'm interested in. I'd rather make wine that I want than what everybody else wants.
So let's talk about some of your wines then. I had a good time on your website going through all your wines and looking at the notes. So I want to start with these single vineyard Petite Sirahs that you had sent me. So the first one I actually have open here is the Rosewent Vineyard. Am I saying that right? Rosewent?
Rosewent.
Okay. Rosewent Vineyard Petite Sirah. This is a 2018 vintage. So tell me about this wine, how you go through making that and what makes it so.
So that's actually the very first vineyard I ever purchased from when I was coming back from actually on the drive back from Napa to Paso in 2011. I was making phone calls to old friends and stuff like that. And one of them connected me with the owner of Rosewent and kind of took off from there. And so my wife and I actually almost ended up buying this vineyard. It's just a little hobby vineyard, about 1 acre. But we manage it and farm it. I'm in there doing all kinds of work all the time on it. So it's just kind of fantastic. It's self-rooted, which is fun because you don't usually see that. But it's on a sandy loam, so you don't have to worry too much about it. So it's self-rooted clone, Estrella clone, essentially, which is like Gary Eberle's original plantings in Paso. And so, yeah, it's planted VSP. And so basically it reminded me of cab planting. So what I did was I treated I was treating a Napa cab. And so bringing it in, we're doing a little bit longer cold soaks. We're doing very aggressive mixes during fermentation. I'm essentially punching it down 2 or 3 times a day with a délestage, like 3 or 4 times, maybe 5 times, depending on the vintage, based on taste. And so we're pumping it out of, we're doing everything in double macro fermentation vessels, so about 1 to 1.5 tons at a time. Mm-hmm. And so I'm pumping out all of the juice, the fermenting juice and wine out of that bin into a 110-gallon sump through a screen and aerating the heck out of it, and then pumping it right back over the top. And what that does is it really aerates it. And so you're really getting a very stable tannin, more stable color. You're reining back in the fruit and the tannin. I mean, you're making a very stable tannin, but it's not like grippy. It's very tannic, but it's very balanced tannin. So it's not going to overpower your palate the way that some will. And we're doing extended maceration to really kind of rein in the aggressive tannin. It kind of makes these longer chain, very stable tannins, so very ageable, which actually not a lot of people are doing extended macerations in Paso anymore. It reduces your overall phenolics. So you'll lose a little bit of color. You don't actually lose tannin. People say you're losing your tannin content, but you're getting a less large raw number, but you're getting more long chain stable tannins because they're binding together. And so you actually have more stable tannin, just less raw number. And so you're creating these stable long chain tannins that are very soft on the tongue, they're very ageable, really create a wine that lasts a very long time. And so people are doing this in Bordeaux for the last 300 years. They do it in Napa, and that's how you get these really, really ageable cabs, basically. And so I'm treating it just like I treat a cab, and then we're pressing it to a tank, letting it settle, and then clean racking it into cab barrels.
So as far as the barrel process, what kind of barrels do you use? What kind of aging this particular Petite Sirah, the Rosewent Vineyard, what does that usually get?
For the Rosewent Vineyard, we're using 225-liter cab barrels. And so primarily Seguin Moreau Icones and Medalier Chêne Colberts.
As far as aging is concerned in the barrel, how long does that
months.
Go? 18 months. Okay.
18 months. Got
it. And then once they're done in the barrels, and they go into bottle, for how long before you get released?
About 6 months.
If you had to come up with a good food pairing for this Petite Sirah, I have to admit that's not one of my specialties. So what would be a good food pairing to go with this Rosewent Vineyards Petite Sirah that I've got here?
We generally pair it with lamb or elk or game, like an elk, a venison, something like that. But definitely lamb and game is very food friendly with the Rosewent.
So the other one that you sent is the Gemini Vineyards Petite Sirah. So compare this one to this Rosewent Vineyard Petite Sirah.
So Gemini Vineyard is a rocky, steep hillside vineyard in Pomar. So it's one of the most phenolically rich sites I've ever worked with, just super dark and tannic. That one is Clone 3, which is the Durif French clone, the original Petite Sirah clone is actually ended up being Clone 3 in the American system. On, I think it's St. George or 1103P rootstock, but it's like this just super steep rocky hillside. It actually reminds me a lot of the Hermitage. I ended up doing a tour with Michel Chapoutier's winery, and they took us up into his little section of the Hermitage, and just it really reminds me of that, just the rockiness, steepness. And so you just get this dark, tannic, tiny berried Petite Sirah. And so that one I'm doing punch downs only, whole berry, pressed directly to larger format like Syrah barrels. And so it's playing in completely different styles. That one's dark fruit, minerality, white pepper, like more traditional Petite Sirah. I get a lot of coffee notes off that one too as well. But definitely like much more of a traditional style Petite Sirah. But it still has that elegance and that balance that I strive for. It's not overwhelming the way it could be.
So you mentioned ageability earlier on these wines. How long do you think you could age one of these? Like I've got a 2018 here. So just kind of give me your thoughts on how long this thing will age, maybe when the peak drinkability time is for this kind of wine. I mean, it's excellent tonight. I'm enjoying it tonight, but I just thought I'd ask you about the aging.
At least another 5 to 10 years, probably longer, especially on the Rosewent because of the aging style. But it's Petite Sirah, so it'll age a very long time. Yeah. It'll keep going. I mean, like I said, we're still drinking 11s, 12s, 13s. Not a problem. So for me, I like my wines a little bit younger for a winemaker. A lot of winemakers like to age their wines a very long time. Whereas I like my wines probably in the 5 to 10 year range as opposed to like the 20-year range or something like that. So the thing about wine's very personal. And so people ask me how long things are going to age, and I kind of, it hem and haw because it's hard because when you like your wine, it's not exactly the same time I'm going to like my wine.
Sure.
Yeah. I don't want people to try and change their palates to accommodate my palate when it's really, I want you to enjoy the wine for yourself. I want you to enjoy it when you think it's going to be the best. I don't want I think it's going to be the best. Yeah.
I do see that a lot, though, in some of the wine groups that I belong to and some of the people I talk to say, oh, you're drinking that way too young, or gosh, you should let that sit down for this much time or whatever. But I think you make a good point in that everybody has their own taste and what they like. And so if you like a 2018 wine today, then good for you and enjoy it at that time, you know?
For me personally, I'm probably going to wait for another 3 years before I start really drinking the 18.
Okay.
Based on what I've tasted. Although 18 is a surpriser. Everybody in 18 thought 18 was going to be like every winemaker you talk to, every industry person thought 2018 was the best vintage. It's like a vintage of a century.
I've heard that a lot.
The scorers all talk about 13 and 16, but like all of us winemakers and industry people are talking about like 18. And then the scores all come out and like the 18s get these really low scores and we're like, what the heck's going on? And we're all looking at it, tasting it, and we're like, this is going to age forever. And so give it another 4 or 5 years. And so I say 3 years, but thinking back on the actual 18s, I'm thinking like 5 or 6 years for me. And I like my wines a little younger. So I think they're going to age forever because 18 was what every industry person is saying was a phenomenal year. We were all shocked. Like we've been talking about it for the last 2 years about how low the scores were for 18 compared to 17, 19. And it's just been crazy. Like we're just unexpectedly crazy.
I was saying a minute ago, I was looking through the wines that you make. So you make a Grenache, and then you make something called it says 2019 red, and it's a blend. Is that right? Am I getting that right?
Yeah, my red it's not something we pour or sell in the tasting room necessarily. I mean, we don't pour it, but we'll sell it. But it's kind of my cash flow wine, my wholesale wine. I call it my discovery brand. I was having dinner with one of the winemakers for Dow one time. He was talking about his discovery brand. I'm like, dude, I'm totally stealing that right now. And so I would call it a discovery. And it makes sense because it's something that helps people discover our brand.
Sure.
We have had that wine by the glass at this restaurant in Morro Bay for probably 7 years.
Wow.
My taster is in Morro Bay for a while. And every weekend during the summer, we'd get 1 or 2 groups come through. We had your wine by the glass at this restaurant. We're going to come taste your wines. We're going to join the wine club. We're going to buy a case. And so it's something that helps people discover my brand, which is why it's still branded as MCV, because a lot of people in Paso have taken to having a second label or second brand.
Sure, yeah.
Napa, they don't really do that. So Napa tends to have, rather than having secondary labels, they tend to have primary labels that are slightly differentiated from the primary label. And so what that does is it really helps people with brand recognition. So if you're having, I don't know, Beringer Knights Valley Cab, and you love it for $20, well, maybe you're going to try the $80, Beringer whatever cab. And so it helps to guide people to the primary brand. And so that's what red is for me. It's $22 retail in the winery with always a special going on case purchases because it is our discovery wholesale cash flow label, but it's distributed all across the United States in like 9 or 10 states. We're on East Coast, Central, West Coast, all that stuff. So it's 10 states. So it's 20% of the country, but it's still, East Coast, West Coast. And you can usually find it at restaurants for by the glass, which is what kind of the goal is that one is for by the glass. You can also find it at some wine shops, stuff like that. But really that's what that is. It's just kind of something that I do that is wine. I get some less expensive grapes from the east side of Paso, and I make them for that. And it's also the higher press cuttings of my reserve wines because I don't put my higher press cuttings into my reserve wines. I put them aside and put them into that. And then we sell it for a very reasonable price that helps people find MCV.
Oh, good. I was looking at another wine. It's called 1105. This is a cool wine because I'm looking at what it's made of. Petite Sirah, Tannat, Syrah, Grenache, Petit Verdot, and 10% Viognier. So I think I got 10 here. I got the wrong number. So 1% Viognier. So I've never seen that before. And so I took a note of it because I want to make sure to ask you about that. What does the Viognier do to the wine? And just tell me overall, 1105, where does that name come from? What's that wine all about?
So 1105 is my flagship wine. And so it's something that I make every year. Kind of when I started this whole thing, it was Petite Sirah specializing, but I really wanted to make blends. And so as I said, I'm like a constant blender. I love blending. And so 1105 is really my expression of my winery. And so we're taking Petite Sirah and then blending it with things that I feel are going to enhance that. So the 11 we were talking about just had Syrah and Grenache. And then in 13, we brought in Tannat and Petit Verdot. The Viognier comes from co-fermentation of the Syrah. And so I'm co-fermenting my Syrah with about 3 to 5% Viognier. And so what that does for the Syrah is it enhances the aromatics, gives it a little bit of a savory note. It's very Northern Rhone Côte Rôtie. So that's where the Viognier comes from. I'm not adding finished Viognier into the wine. And then you have all the different grapes. The Grenache, for me, in there for the aromatics. And so Grenache is a very, very aromatic grape. And so when I added it, it really boosts the aromatics of olive grape, kind of lifts all of the grapes in there up. And so we are using the Grenache for that. But what it is, it's also a lighter bodied red. And so it kind of shaves the harsher edges off the bigger, heavier grapes and helps them kind of link together. At least that's what I feel like. And then you get your Tannat in there for the front palate. Tannat is one of the black grapes. It's actually the thickest skinned grapes, very anthocyanin rich. And so the first flavors of the 1105 are kind of this herbally raspberry note. It's not Petite Sirah for your mid palate. And kind of the backbone of the wine. It's very structural, very dark. And so kind of just lends itself to like the whole body of the wine. So when you're tasting 1105, it should really taste like Petite Sirah, but like enhanced. And then you get Syrah, kind of enhances the mid palate a little bit. You get a little smokiness, a little bit of meatiness. And then Petit Verdot is a back palate finishing grape, very structural. And so it really finishes the wine strongly, gives it a lot of structure, a lot of balance. And so when you taste 1105 for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes, you should really just be still tasting the wine because Verdot is there kind of elongating the entire wine.
So I'm looking at these percentages here and I'm thinking to myself, these probably vary from vintage to vintage, or is it something is it based on taste? Is that kind of how you decide how much to go of each grape to go into the blend?
Yes, it's a very designed blend. And so around Christmas time, traditionally in the past, it has been this way. My wife, my father, and my sister and I all get together and I put together these blends. I have my pipettes and graduated cylinders and samples, and we're sitting there and I'm putting together all of these blends. And I generally do 6 at a time, 100 mils per sample, because 100 mils is super easy because 1 mil is 1%. So it makes my life significantly easier. And so I'll put together 6 of those. We'll taste through. I taste basically monthly, 15 months out of 18. We don't usually do harvest and pre-bottling, but so I'm tasting basically monthly. I know what each barrel tastes like. I know what each wine tastes like. And so I kind of have a preset idea of what I want. One of them is exact percentages based on exactly what we have. And that's just the baseline. But really, I kind of have already pre-created some of them in my mind. And so I start working off of that and we taste through. I get notes. The 1105 is mine. It's my wine. It's my expression. The final blend is mine. And so I take the suggestions and the notes from my family and kind of integrate them, but it's not really, I don't let them finish the wine. For me, it's, if they're like, oh, you should do this, this, or this, but I'm like, no, this is perfect. When I say it's perfect, it's perfect. But I usually will appreciate other people's comments and trying to adjust it a little bit. And so that's how we make it. We usually takes me about 3 rounds of 6, I usually carry the 1 or 2, depending on how the round went. I'll carry 1 or 2 from the previous round forward. Usually takes me 3 rounds. I think in 2012, it took me like 7 rounds. I was there for like 8 hours just blending. It was terrible. It is what it is. And so, or 13, something like that. It was, we went a long time, but generally it's 2 or 3 rounds and I have it. It's never like the first one I pour is that's it. So we do the same thing with black, but black is usually done within 1 round, to be honest.
So I was going to ask you about black.
Black always, every year, I swear, almost every year, invariably ends up being 70% Petite Sirah, 20% Tannat, and 10% Petit Verdot on paper, and then based on what we've topped with, and the course of the wine's life cycle is based off that. So it's usually like 71, 72% Petite Sirah, 18, 19% Tannat, 8, 9% Petit Verdot, because usually what happens is Petit Verdot is the very last grape that comes in, and so it finishes, and so we use that to top up all of the wines that have been finished for a month. And so we're like, oh, it's time to top. Let's top with Petit Verdot. And so everything gets half a gallon to a gallon of Petit Verdot per barrel. And then the rest of the year we top with Petite Sirah because that's what I specialize in. So about 60%, 70% of what I bring in is Petite Sirah. And so we usually generally top with Syrah. And so we end up with a higher percentage of Petit Verdot and Petite Sirah. So that's not might be 96% Tannat and 1% Petit Verdot and 3% Petite Sirah. And so when you finish that blend, you end up with like 71, 19, 10 or something.
Mm-hmm. What a great experience. Yeah. So real quick, where does the 1105 name come from? What does that mean?
It's a play on the MCV. MCV in Roman numerals 1105.
Okay. Very interesting. So let's go on to a couple of the other wines here. So you also make a Petite Sirah port dessert wine. It's named, is it CFV? Am I getting that right? CFV?
I have two different Petite Sirah port wines.
Okay.
And so I made them for my children, actually. And so CFV is my first son, Christopher Francisco.
Okay.
And so we had our first son in 2016. And so I wanted to do something that was unique and special. And so Paso is wonderful. I mean, we are very warm, as I've mentioned. We're so dynamic and unique. There's so many microclimates, so many different terroirs you get here. And none of them are super ageable, although I did have an 89 Everly Cab on Saturday, but none of them are super ageable necessarily. So I wanted something that would age long enough for them to have when they turn 21, when they turn 51, when they turn 81.
Yeah.
And so the only thing that was really going to work was a port. And so I specialize in Petite Sirah, and so I picked Petite Sirah. And so I found some good Petite Sirah from the west side, from Adelaide District, and I made port. And I named it after, CFV is named after my first one, Christopher Francisco. And then I made another one 2 years later for my second son, Jacob Matthew. And so I bought the grapes from the exact same block of the exact same vineyard. That way, there's no way they can argue for any reason down the line. I made it with the same brandy, the same everything else otherwise. And so yeah. So I put aside 10 cases for each of them.
Wow, that's awesome. And believe it or not, I've met another winemaker who's done the same thing for their kids. So it's a really cool thing to do for them. Now, how old are these kids? Do they appreciate what you're doing for them right now, or do they even care at this point?
Christopher, the older one, likes to sign his bottles when people buy them with crown.
Oh, that's cool.
He actually will sit there and sign them with a crown.
Oh, that's awesome.
Puts his name on it. People love it. We are a family winery. You know, I worked in Napa and we're down here and I make some really nice wine, but I don't want to become an unreachable, snooty winery. I want to be a family-friendly winery that has great wines. The one that always comes to mind that I want to be like, that really kind of would be my goal, is Raffinelli up in Sonoma. My parents have been on their wine list for, I don't know, how old am I, 40? So 40 years. And so they remember growing up, the kids running through the kitchen when they were just tasting wine in the people's kitchens. I mean, we've had tastings at our house. Our house is 2 minutes from the winery. And we literally, while we were building this place, after we closed our tasting room in Morro Bay and we were building this place up, we would host people at our house and just 2 minutes away from here. And, you know, they would tell me stories about the Raffinelli kids running through the kitchen, like signing, you know, wine club slips in crown, and just,
wow.
That's what I want, because wine should be wonderful and unique and special, but it should also be approachable. And, you know, we're just, that's really what I want, is something special.
So do you sell that port dessert wine? Okay. I'm a big port fan, so I'll definitely have to check that out. I don't know if I've had a Petite Sirah port before, so I'll have to definitely check that out.
Petite Sirah port and dessert wine is kind of unique. You'd expect it to be like blueberry, but it's not. It's actually like mission fig. So it's the most interesting thing. You're tasting it and smelling it, and it just smells like a mission fig dipped in dark chocolate.
Wow.
So, I mean, it's Paso, so you get the chocolate, but, you know, you'd expect the blueberries and the white pepper. And no, with dessert port or Petite Sirah, even like just late harvest Petite Sirah, there's no blueberry apparent. It's all mission fig. It's the strangest thing.
Wow. Well, so you also make a couple of whites, right? You make a Vineyard, and then you make this very interesting thing called Grenache Gree. So that looked very interesting and unique, and I'm really a big fan of things that are unique. So on the website, I see you guys have it in the glass. It almost looks like orange juice. So tell me about that.
So Grenache Gree, it's actually an idea of my staff. They wanted to make something interesting. I was talking to a friend of mine who had some extra grapes, and he mentioned Grenache Gree. And so they were like, oh, Grenache Gree, we should definitely make Grenache Gree. And they started going off on this whole thing about how, you know, Grenache Gree, and it's interesting. And they settled on wanting to make a carbonic maceration Grenache Gree.
Okay.
And I said, okay, I have no idea how to make carbonic maceration, but we can figure it out. And so we researched it a bit and worked on it, ended up making a carbonic maceration Grenache Gree. And so we took the fruit and basically sorted it directly into a large tank, a whole cluster, and then we were just kind of keeping it gassed and on CO2 for its entire time in there so it can go through its enzymatic reactions for carbonic maceration. Pressed it as a white wine, finished it out with some very estery yeast. And so we got kind of an orangey wine. And it's very appley. It's not like orange or anything. It's very, very appley. So it's kind of really interesting. I'm glad we did it. I think we're definitely doing it again next year. So worked out well enough that we're going to do it again.
So is that something you guys sell also or not?
Yes.
So I want to ask you about a couple of other things. So you mentioned it earlier. You moved into a new tasting room in the Tin City Annex in 2019. And I don't know if you mentioned why. So why did you move?
Well, my original tasting room was in Tin City before it was Tin City.
Oh, okay.
And so I had moved into Tin City. I was basically in a shared tasting room when I first opened in 2013 with another winery. And so we were doing that, and then they weren't doing so well. And so they closed down, and I took over the tasting room, and then they were doing even worse. And so they forfeited their lease. And so I lost my lease due to that. The landlord of Tin City offered me the lease on the building, but it was pretty large. It was like 5,000 feet, and this was like 2015. I just wasn't there. And so I bailed. I was living in Cayucas, which is on the coast of SLO County at the time, and I was wandering around Morro Bay, which is just south of there on the coast, and with a friend of mine, and I saw a for lease sign right next to another winery that had a tasting room there, and so I decided to do it. And so I took the lease there because during the summer months and spring and fall months, there's tons of people, foot traffic and everything else. I thought it'd be a good idea. And so I took that spot, and then we were there for about 5 years. And then I had the opportunity to come back to Tin City. And it's a much larger building, actually. It's like 6,500 feet. And so we were doing custom crush AP for quite a few people on top of our own production. And so we're doing about 130 to 150 tons a year through this facility. 30 of it's mine. And so we're back home to Tin City.
Wow. So I was doing some research on the website, and there was a couple of things that really caught my attention. You guys moved, and you had this great tasting room all set up. And then unfortunately, like a lot of things, COVID hit, and it was just horrible timing, for that.
We moved in March 1st, 2020, and our grand opening was March 14th. The initial kind of no things over 500 people happened March 12th, and then everything proceeded to get shut down like March 17th. And so we kind of had a grand opening, but yeah, we moved in at a really bad time, and we'd spent months and months advertising we're moving, going out telling people, and then everything kind of shut down. And so it's kind of interesting experience.
So I just wanted to ask you, as a business owner, is that something that you can account for, or like in your business plan, something like this may happen? Or is this just one of those things that you could never even saw coming or even thought about coming?
It's one of those things you never, ever anticipate. My wife did an amazing thing. She did all those little 2-ounce like taster kits. Everybody's doing like at-home tasting kits. We were one of the first ones to do it. And so we actually populate pretty highly up on Google searches. And so we do a lot of those things, especially around the holidays with like corporates. I mean, we'll do, I think the largest one we've done is 130 people, these little 2-ounce taster kits. But we do them all the time. They're very popular. But she did that. I found a few clients. I mean, everybody was, we had moved in with the anticipation of being full because I'd been talking to people about coming in for AP Custom Crush from the beginning. And then all of a sudden, nobody moved in. And I had an empty 6,500 square feet I was paying for and harvested eventually. And we filled up. I mean, we did more than I thought we were going to. Not as much as we did last year, but a fair bit. And so, and then the government did fairly well by small businesses for the most part. We made it through. So I mean, it was not something that anybody could really anticipate. And we've managed to scrape by and make it through. Yeah.
Well, I saw some of those cool ideas that you guys came up with, and that I wrote those down because I want to talk to you about that. The at-home tasting kits seemed like a really cool idea. The Zoom tasting parties that you guys talk about on the website seem like a really cool thing. These are things that I would say, just from my experience with wineries, these are not things that that common, I guess, before this COVID thing happened. Like a lot more of these things kind of happened after that. Is that right?
Yeah, nobody's really doing any at-home tasting anything other than like the winemaker showing up with cases to do like a private thing for wealthy people. But this really gave people the accessibility to tastings at home. So they're fun, but they can be cost prohibitive, but they are a lot of fun. And so if it's something you want to do, I recommend it. Just remember that shipping is outrageously expensive. We get yelled at all the time about how much shipping costs, and there's nothing you can do about it. I mean,
right. What are you going to do? Yeah.
It costs me $25 to ship a case to, Sacramento or San Diego, or $90 to a case to Florida. It's like, you can yell at me all day about a case of wine taking $90 to get to Florida, but I'm sorry that UPS charges it, but that's
that's out of your control. Definitely. So I also see you guys offer a winemaker guided tasting experience with tasting out of barrels and that kind of stuff.
Oh, it's my favorite.
Is that popular? I was going to ask you, is that a popular thing?
It's becoming so, but
that's one of the things I would actually love to do.
Well, that's my favorite thing. I'm actually not wonderful in large groups, large multi-group tastings. Like when I'm just working in the tasting room by myself and there's like 4 groups, I'm terribly awkward and awful because I'm going like 7 different directions and it's just terrible. I really just want to talk to like one group of people at a time about the wine and why I love it and what it is and just get into it. And this is where I really get to do that because basically going to take people and we're going to do a tasting of 6 or 7 wines that I pick, that I want to pick, that I'm feeling like when I show up that morning, because it's not like I actually plan ahead. I'm like, oh, we have a winemaker group at 10. I'll get there at 9 and be like, I'm feeling like tasting this, 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 and this. And I'll just grab them off the shelf and off we go. And then we taste them. And so it's what I feel like at the moment. So I can really talk about it because I'm really feeling it. Yeah. And then we get in there and we get this really beautiful charcuterie spread from this local cheesemonger, Vivant Fine Cheese, who is fantastic. Danica, we've worked with her since the very beginning. She's absolutely fantastic. She puts together the spread, the charcuterie for us. And so we can do that. And then we do some barrel tasting. We just hang out for like an hour and a half, 2 hours. And I really just get to engage because I like to joke that if I could, I would just live in my barrel room by myself like a troll. Yeah. Never talk to anybody. And so that's what I would love. But having one group of people I can really focus on really allows me to talk about the wine, talk about, me in the wine.
So what do you guys charge for that kind of experience?
I think it's $100.
Okay.
Per person.
All right. I think that's
so it's not cheap, but like I said, you get 6 or 7 current release wine, it's not even current release because it's literally whatever I feel like. So I could grab an 11, a 13, a 14, and 3 18. Whatever I feel like right then when I'm looking at it, that's what I grab. And then you get some barrel tasting and Danica does a great job.
And we get you for 2 hours. And
you get me for 2 hours.
That's pretty cool.
Usually for that price, you only get me for 30 minutes. So.
Oh, okay. Okay. Gotcha. All right.
If you're a client making wine here, you wouldn't get me that long. So no, it's great. I was telling you we're in Paso. We should probably only charge this. I'm like, you know what? This is a great experience. Like people are never going to forget this. This is something special you're going to talk about for years.
Right.
Let's just charge for it. I mean, in Napa, people are charging $100 for a basic taste. Like you walk into a tasting room with 70 other people and you're tasting at a bar, like completely surrounded to the point where you can't even move and you're getting charged $100. Let's just go for it. It's something that is special and you won't forget.
Well, one thing for me, like wine to me is an experience. So that kind of experience is worth $100 to me. To go through that, like you said, something that I'll remember for a long time. So good for you. I'm hoping one day I get down there and I can be involved in something like that. I saw something about this professional tasting group. You guys get together and do tastings. What is that all about? And how does that help you? Is it about developing your palate or is it about trying wines from other winemakers in the area?
It's multiple things. Most winemakers are in professional groups. I mean, if you're not tasting other people's wine that's not yours, you can develop what's called a cellar palate. And so you get a very one-dimensional palate. And so it's really a negative thing because everything suffers. Your wine suffers. Everybody suffers because you're only drinking your own stuff and it becomes this television kind of a thing. So it's very important to taste and drink lots of different wines because it keeps your palate broad. And even if you hate all the wines, one of my good friends did a Portuguese tasting and it was the worst thing I've ever had. Every wine was disgusting except for one. And it was like awful, undrinkable stuff. But it was important because we got a perspective on other wines. We had one on Tuesday that was basically Mostly Mosel from Germany. And
Mm-hmm.
but we were having like the most random things. I mean, like varieties you've never ever heard of. I actually have to pull up my tasting sheet here that I just go over at so I can remember the names of these things, because these are things that I don't normally drink. You know, we had like Oreros. I can't even pronounce it. It's an Alsatian variety. We had like a Gelbert Orleans. We had, I remember there being a Gruner Allofrankisch. I have no idea. There's Treminers, there was Kerners, there was Portuguesers.
Wow.
It was the most random stuff. The best were obviously Rieslings, because it's Riesling from Germany, so obviously it's going to be the best.
Yeah.
But we had some very random, strange things, and I was like, he was just listing off like, this is 10% that and 20% that. And I'm like, okay, that's great. We're never going to drink it here, but it's super important to get exposed to, because it really gives you a broader perspective of the wine industry. And so just beyond even tasting, it also helps you with things like marketing and sales and all those other things. The hardest part of this industry is not actually making the wine. Anybody can make wine.
Sure.
I'm not sure everybody can make great wine, but anybody can make wine. It's actually very easy. Wine naturally lends itself that way. I had a professor at Davis that I had. She used to like to say, don't worry, no human pathogen grows in wine. So you can make the worst, most foulest wine in the world, but it's not going to kill you. So you can make wine. It's never going to kill you. But to make great wine is more difficult. But the hardest part of this business is actually selling the wine. So getting out there and moving your product and selling it. And so it's important for that too, because you need to see not just the different varieties, the different flavors, because none of the varieties we had, not a single one of the varieties we had on Tuesday applied to Paso in any way. We're not making any of that wine here.
Yeah.
Right now, not a single one. But it's important to see what's out there in terms of market.
So one thing I like to ask towards the end of the interviews is, besides your own wines, what kind of wines are you enjoying right now?
Depends on my mood, depends on what I'm eating, depends on all kinds of things. I buy wines from all over the world. Doesn't matter to me. I tend to drink white wines from Europe and red wines from America, from California more specifically. And that tends to be where my palate focuses on, but there's always exceptions. Argentinian Malbec and Chilean Carmenere and, Chilean Criollo, Argentinian Criollos. Whatever it is. There's so many varieties out there that it's hard to follow. But yeah, my general palate falls along European whites, French and Spanish, Italian. There's a Kirkland Tincture, Costco, Friuli Grave Pinot Grigio that for $5 is unbeatable. I mean, where are you going to find crisp, acidic, flavorful, aromatic white wine for $5? They have a Chablis Premier Cru for $17. It's insane. I found this deal through a distributor of Ribera del Duero for almost nothing. That I think about like 4 cases because it was so cheap and it was so delicious. And we've been slowly drinking through that. I mean, we're not drinking it with shrimp or anything, but for having steak or ribs or whatever, it's like, for this price we can open it whenever we want. But it's a Ribera del Duero, so it's very tannic, very acidic, and will overpower certain things. I drink a fair bit of MCV, to be honest, just because it's readily available and it tastes good. I drink so many different wines from so many different people from so many different areas that it's hard for me to say that I drink this or that or the other thing.
Well, I have to say this Petite Sirah is excellent. I really look forward to trying that other one. And next time I'm in Paso Robles, I will definitely go by MCV and try the other wines. So thank you so much for joining me tonight and sharing your story. You got an inspiring story. I don't know if you know that or not, or if you pay attention to that, but it is an inspiring story. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me tonight.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you, Matt, for sharing your story and your fabulous wine with me tonight. Matt is living his dream of owning his own winery and making his own wine. But his journey is unique, which makes his story so inspirational. I encourage you to try one of these single vineyard Petite Sirahs from MCV Wines, or his flagship red blend he calls 1105, which is a blend of Petite Sirah, Syrah, and Grenache. You can find my tasting notes for this wine on my website at www.obsessedwithwine.net. I will also put a link to their website in the show notes so you can read about the winery and purchase some of their wines for yourself. I want to thank you for being a part of episode number 4 of Obsessed with Wine podcast. Whether you're new to the podcast or have listened before, I would appreciate it if you would rate and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts so you won't miss any episodes. I also encourage you to email me at obsessedwithwine@yahoo.com with any feedback you may have on making the show better. Thank you, and I'll see you next week. Cheers!